In the winter of 1887, a single photograph was sent to the Charleston courthouse, and it would haunt investigators for decades to come. It shows 17 children ages 3 to 16 standing barefoot in the snow in front of a rundown house deep in the remote valleys of West Virginia. But it's not just their emaciated bodies or their vacant eyes that make this photo so chilling. It's the iron chains around their ankles that truly send a chill down your spine. According to official records, the Greylock family of Bone Creek Hollow reported only 4 children living in the house. The other 13 appear to have been completely erased from all records. Birthdays never recorded, their existence denied by every adult in the isolated mountain community. Before we continue the story of the Greylock family and the unspeakable crimes they hid in the Appalachian Mountains, please subscribe to Sleepy History Tales and turn on notifications so you never miss the dark stories that history deliberately hides. By the way, what state are you watching from, and what time is it where you are watching? Leave us a comment and let us know. That photo is just the beginning. It opens a mystery exposing one of the most systematic child exploitation cases in American history. Bone Creek Hollow, with its age-old silence and silent complicity, is carved into the West Virginia mountains like a scar that will never heal. In 1887, this remote valley lived in a world of its own. The treacherous mountain roads became impassable in the harsh winter. The nearest town, Cedar Ridge, is 27 miles away through winding deer trails that can swallow anyone unfamiliar with the mountain's secrets. In this hidden corner of America, families live by their own rules, bound by blood silence and the unspoken understanding that what happens in the hollow stays in the hollow. The Greylock family has occupied the valley's most fertile land since 1834, when Jeremiah Greylock led his wife and 6 children across the Cumberland Gap as part of the Great Migration West. Unlike other families seeking gold or fertile farmland, Jeremiah had other ambitions. He understood that isolation offered opportunity to those willing to operate outside the public eye. The valley provided everything he needed: clean water from Bone Creek, fertile soil for his crops, dense forests for hunting, and most importantly, complete freedom from government, church, or nosy neighbors. By 1887, 3 generations of Greylocks had transformed the mountain retreat into a system far more complex than a simple farm. Ezekiel Greylock, Jeremiah's grandson, controlled not only his own family, but also an elaborate network of relatives' hired workers and what local records euphemistically called ward orphans. Children whose origins were unquestioned and whose welfare was unmonitored. The hollow became a self-sufficient world where Ezekiel's word was law, his justice absolute, and his methods of maintaining order both creative and terrifying. Ezekiel was a man forged by the harsh mountain environment. Tall and lean as a young hickory, his eyes cold as winter ice. He was so intelligent that many underestimated him because of his rustic accent and patched clothes. But behind that rustic exterior was a calculating mind, one that spent decades perfecting a system of control that would earn the respect of even the most ruthless plantation owners. His wife, Martha Greylock, born Martha Kellerman in a neighboring hollow, had become as hard and ruthless as the rocky peaks surrounding their home after 30 years of isolation. The Greylock children, at least 4 of them to be recognized, reflected their parents' strict philosophy. Samuel, the eldest, 19, inherited his father's cold intelligence and ruthless creativity. Rebecca, 17, possessed a quiet ruthlessness that revealed itself in small but calculated acts. Twin brothers Jacob and Jeremiah, just 14 years old, have learned that survival in this family means absolute obedience and keeping quiet about everything they witness. But these 4 children are just the tip of the iceberg, hiding a much deeper and more horrific reality. The Greylocks' true power lay not in their land or their crops, but in their ability to collect and control children. Children whose disappearances would never be investigated, whose cries of despair would never be heard beyond the mountain walls, and whose labors would never be compensated. In an age of high infant mortality, poor birth records, and almost non-existent communication between remote communities, the Greylocks realized they could operate a private kingdom completely outside the reach of the law. The way they collected children was as simple as it was cruel. During the harsh winters, destitute families from surrounding hollows would sometimes approach Ezekiel, offering to bind out their children, a common practice, where families in need sent their children to other homes in exchange for food, shelter, and the promise of an education. But once the children crossed the threshold of Bone Creek Hollow, they entered a world where the law no longer held sway, where their families of origin were told that their children had been sent to opportunities in the big towns, and where the new reality was closer to slavery than apprenticeship. Other children came from even darker paths: orphans from failed homesteads, babies left behind in remote churches, children who had lost their parents to mining accidents or to the plagues that ravaged Appalachian communities, all found their way to Greylock through a network of corrupt county officials, untrustworthy itinerant preachers, and opportunistic neighbors who took small payments for their silence and cooperation. By the winter of 1887, the system had been running smoothly for more than 2 decades. The Greylock household officially numbered only 6, but in reality, it was a carefully orchestrated community of 21 souls, 17 of whom existed in a shadow world of hard labor, starvation, and systematic brutality, enough to shock even the most hardened observers of the harsh times. The final photograph exposing the Greylocks' crimes was never taken as evidence. In December 1887, an itinerant photographer named Henry Petton traveled through the mountain communities taking family photos for the extremely reasonable price of just 50 cents per session. For remote families who might never see another photographer, this was a precious opportunity to preserve memories. Petton heard about the Greylocks while at Cedar Ridge. Local merchants spoke of them with a mixture of respect and reserve, describing Ezekiel as someone who always paid his debts in cash and who seemed to produce large quantities of produce and preserved foods for trade, despite the harsh conditions of the isolated hollow. Fascinated by the family's story of prosperity and hoping for a lucrative contract, Petton set out on the arduous journey to Bone Creek Hollow on December 15, 1887. What he saw challenged every assumption about the lives of deep mountain families. Greylock Farm was not the rough log house Petton had imagined, but a complex of elaborate structures built around a central courtyard. The main house was built from finely cut chestnut trees with many rooms, glass doors, and stone chimneys, signaling long-term prosperity. Surrounding it were a large barn, several outbuildings, workshops, and dormitory-style buildings that looked more like institutional facilities than family homes. But the first thing that caught Petton's eye were the children. When he arrived, Ezekiel proudly presented his 4 official children, each dressed neatly and cleanly and behaving with strict discipline. But as Peyton set up his equipment in the middle of the courtyard, he began to see other children lurking in the shadows between the buildings. Thin figures, patched clothes, moving cautiously, always alert. When Peyton asks Ezekiel about these dark children, the mountain father speaks sweetly and reasonably, hiding a horrifying truth that is difficult for anyone unfamiliar to perceive. The children Ezekiel said were simply hired. Hands, children, orphans. The family had adopted as acts of religious charity, or distant relatives helping out with the harvest. All seemed perfectly normal for a large remote mountain ranch where kinship networks were extensive and informal adoption was a survival strategy. But as Peyton prepared to take the family photo, something broke the smooth facade Greylock had constructed. A noise came from one of the outbuildings, running feet, shouting, and something that sounded like the clanking of chains. Several shadow children rushed into the central courtyard, and for the first time, Peyton got a clear look at them. These were not the healthy, well-fed children Ezekiel had described. They were gaunt figures, their eyes vacant, their tattered clothes hanging like shrouds. And around their ankles in the winter light were iron chains, connected by short chains, allowing them to walk, but preventing escape. The next scene burned into Peyton's memory like a vivid photograph. Martha Greylock screamed in a cruel tone, practiced over decades. Samuel and Rebecca quickly rushed to catch the fleeing children, using the leather straps with a cold skill. Ezekiel's mask of politeness slipped away, revealing a cold, calculating man issuing swift orders to discipline and subdue the young workers. In that chaotic moment, Peyton's professional photographic instincts overcame his shock. His camera had been ready, and almost without thinking, he pressed the shutter. The resulting photograph showed the 17 children standing in the snow outside the main house, their chains visible, their eyes and faces expressing despair and horror, an image that time could not erase from his memory. The consequences were swift and terrifying. Ezekiel realized what had happened and asked for the negative. But Peyton, realizing he had just captured something horrifying, said that the negative had been ruined and that he needed to prepare a new negative, buying time to quietly create a second negative containing the murder scene while pretending to prepare for the retake. He finally produced a successful family photograph, just the 4 children, neatly arranged, making Ezekiel believe that evidence of the crime had been hidden. Peyton left Bone Creek Hollow that night, carrying 2 negatives, one showing the Greylocks as they wanted to be remembered, and another revealing a truth so horrifying that it would haunt him for the rest of his life. 3 days later, as he developed the photos in his Cedar Ridge hotel room, Peyton's hands shook. The images of the 17 chained children seemed to stare back at him from the paper, their silent suffering demanding justice, a justice he had no idea how to deliver. In an era when photography was still viewed with suspicion in many rural areas, laws protecting children were few, and the testimony of landowners was respected more than that of outsiders. Peyton faced a terrible choice: live in silence and live with his conscience, or risk everything to expose a crime that most people would find easier to deny than confront. Henry Peyton's decision to act did not come immediately. 3 weeks after returning to Charleston, he was still paralyzed by the weight of the discovery and the possible consequences. The photos sat in a safe in his studio, known only to him, while Peyton wrestled with questions that had no easy answers. In 1888, the West Virginia legal system was ill-equipped to deal with crimes like these, especially when they involved established landowners in remote areas. Child labor was widespread and largely unregulated. Informal adoptions and informal apprenticeships were common practices, leaving little chance of justice. The line between strict discipline and criminal abuse was often determined by local custom rather than law. But more troublingly, Peyton began to realize through careful investigation that the Greylock family's influence extended far beyond that isolated hollow. When he finally approached the Charleston authorities, the response he received was both mixed and frustrating. County Sheriff James Rutledge listened skeptically to Peyton, but emphasized the practical difficulty of investigating allegations against a family living in such rugged terrain. Rutledge even seemed more familiar with the name Ezekiel Greylock than usual, and was reluctant to ask for details about that acquaintance. He eventually admitted that Greylock had helped law enforcement on numerous occasions and was considered a reliable source of information about criminal activity in the mountains. This revelation raised troubling questions about the extent of Greylock's operations. Over the next months, Peyton patiently investigated and gradually uncovered a web of relationships that proved that the crimes at Bone Creek Hollow were part of a larger system of corruption and exploitation. Court records from surrounding counties showed that Ezekiel Greylock had been involved in dozens of child placement deals over the past 15 years. He often appeared before judges to formalize the adoptions or apprenticeships of orphans, all of which were well documented and appeared legitimate. But when Peyton tried to track down some of these children, he noticed a disturbing pattern. After they were placed in Greylock, they disappeared from all official records. Even more alarming, Peyton discovered that several county officials, including 2 judges and a court clerk, had received large loans from Ezekiel during times of financial hardship. These loans created a dependency, ensuring that the Greylock family's operations were never seriously scrutinized. The mountain patriarch had built a mutually beneficial system of corruption that protected his operations while providing a service that local authorities loved, handling sensitive social issues quietly and efficiently. The complicity did not stop with officials. Local churches, which were supposed to care about child welfare, received generous donations from Greylock. Some pastors actually helped send children to Greylock, believing they were serving a Christian charity by finding homes for orphans and troubled youth. The Greylock family's reputation for hard work, financial stability, and religious devotion made them perfect candidates to handle the children who had been abandoned by society. Even more alarming, Peyton discovered that the Greylock system had been in operation for decades. Elderly residents of the area sometimes admitted to knowing families who had sent children to Greylock during hard times. But they always said that things were going well, that the children had ended up in good positions in distant towns, and that the Greylocks deserved credit for their charity. Peyton began to understand that he was dealing not with individual crimes, but with an entire social system designed to deal with unpleasant truths by making them invisible. The children in his photographs existed in a carefully orchestrated blind spot where society's defense mechanisms did not function. As he delved deeper into history, he discovered that the current generation of Greylocks had inherited and perfected the techniques of their predecessors. Jeremiah Greylock, the first patriarch to settle Bone Creek Hollow, had brought with him an unusually large number of children as slaves and apprentices. Census records from the 1840s, 1850s show that the number of children in the Greylock household fluctuated, with some appearing and disappearing from official records, suggesting a system that had been in place for a long time. Furthermore, fragmentary records from neighboring families suggest that the fates of the children did not match Greylock's. Some families reported that the children left for other opportunities after a short stay with Greylock. But these disappearances followed suspicious patterns, suggesting that it was never just bad luck or chance. After leaving Bone Creek, Hollow Piton could not get over what he had seen. The photo of the 17 chained children haunted him at night, a silent cry for justice. But bringing the evidence to light was a monumental challenge. In West Virginia in the late 1880s, the law was not equipped to handle such elaborate crimes, especially when they involved wealthy and influential landowners. Peyton began contacting journalists and officials he barely knew, and gradually tried to build a story that he knew most people would find so unbelievable that they would reject it. Month after month, he was met with skeptical looks, rejections, even threats. But the photo in his hand was living, indelible proof. Some of the mountain people, when carefully approached, began to reveal fragments of memories of the children who had been sent to Greylock. But they always insisted that Greylock was helping the families, that the children had eventually found better lives in remote towns. Peyton quickly realized that he was dealing not just with a crime family, but with a social system that had been compromised to make its unpleasantness invisible. But he did not give up. Peyton began to take careful notes, collect the testimony of escapees like Sarah, and gradually piece together the web of corruption, bribery, and lies that Greylock had built over decades. Each new piece of evidence opened up another layer of horror, from federal child trafficking cases to the public executions Sarah had witnessed. Through his investigations, Peyton realized that each detail, each name, each number of missing children all added up to a picture. A world where crime was legitimized by habit, reputation, and public indifference. And here, we want to ask you a little interaction. Where are you watching now, and what do you picture in your mind of Bone Creek Hollow? Leave a comment below. Let's imagine together. Peyton knew he needed to make the photo public, but he couldn't do it haphazardly. One wrong move could destroy evidence or put himself and witnesses in danger. He planned to get the photo into the hands of trusted media outlets and to make secret copies in case the photo was confiscated. As the story leaked, the Charleston community erupted with many in disbelief, others outraged, and those familiar with Greylock fighting every attempt to investigate. Peyton realized he was fighting not just for the children in the photo, but also against a long-standing system of power, corruption, and fear. With each piece of evidence, each testimony, each detail, the story of Bone Creek Hollow began to unfold. Not just the crimes of a family in the woods, but a curtain that exposed a society that turned a blind eye to the suffering of children and a system of law enforcement that was largely ineffective. And now we want to ask you, if you were there and had this photo in your hands, what would you have done? Would you have spoken up like Peyton? Or would you have kept quiet to protect yourself? Write your answer below, and together we will reflect on the power of conscience in a society filled with fear. Peyton's every clue gradually revealed a terrible truth. Bone Creek Hollow was not an isolated case. Greylock's operation was just one link in a vast network of child exploitation across Appalachia, so sophisticated and long-running that it was nearly impossible to prosecute through normal legal channels. Too many officials had been bribed, too many years had passed, and too many powerful interests relied on silence to protect these atrocities for decades. With Sarah Kellerman's brutal testimony, Peyton began, the early month of 1889, to build a case strong enough to overcome the political pressure and legal barriers that protected the Greylock family. But he soon realized that Sarah's escape was not a safe one. In February 1889, Sarah received a letter at her home in Cincinnati that made her blood run cold. The letter was written in a careful but scrawlable handwriting that appeared to be that of a person of limited education but great cunning. "We know where you are, Sarah Kellerman. We know about your husband Charles Miller and your daughter Emma. Mountain justice remembers long, and family deaths are never forgotten. A secret should be buried in the hollow where it belongs." The letter was signed with a crude drawing of the Greylock flower, the mountain laurel that had become the family symbol. The discovery that Greylock had been able to track Sarah to Ohio revealed a level of organization and influence that neither Sarah nor Peyton had previously realized. It even suggested that previous victims may have been tracked, threatened, or brought back to the hollow through threats to family members they had built after their escape. Peyton immediately arranged for Sarah and her family to be moved to safety and began investigating how Greylock had been able to track her down. Through his research into Ohio marriage and birth records, he discovered that several government officials had received inquiries about Sarah from people claiming to be family members, seeking to reunite, offering small rewards in exchange for information, and had succeeded in determining her name, address, and current family status. This forced Peyton to confront the reality that his own investigation might have been compromised. If Greylock had the ability to track victims who had escaped across multiple states, they could certainly track any attempts to expose the crime. This suspicion quickly became a reality when Peyton returned to his Charleston studio in March and discovered a thorough but sophisticated search trail. Nothing had been taken, but files had been rummaged through, objects had been moved, and a single Greylock flower had been left on the table, its petals brown. A message both threatening and promising. And just when we thought we had seen it all, the nightmare in Bone Creek Hollow escalated. Reports from the mountains grew more ominous. Groups of men moving through the woods at night, sounds of construction and labor coming from the secluded valley. The number of armed guards patrolling the Greylock property had increased unnaturally. Local merchants had also noted that the Greylocks were purchasing items that suggested they were preparing for a siege, large stores of food ammunition, medical supplies, and building materials to fortify their rooms. More disturbingly, those who had provided information to Peyton began to face direct forms of intimidation. A former county clerk who had received money from Greylock had his barn destroyed by a mysterious fire. A merchant discussing the Greylock family's unusual shopping habits discovered that his store had been burglarized, but the thieves had only taken financial records and correspondence. A pastor who questioned the appropriateness of sending children to the hollow received visits from people who claimed to be religious examiners but instead asked for details about their families and daily routines. And here we ask you, if you were in one of these communities, would you dare speak up, or would you choose to remain silent to protect yourself? Share your thoughts in the comments and see if together we can imagine the terrible pressure people were under. If you find this story creepy, share the video with a friend who loves dark mysteries, click like to support Sleepy History Tales, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on other haunting historical stories. The pattern of intimidation Peyton uncovered showed that the Greylock family's influence was far greater than previously thought. Not only did they have the financial resources to bribe officials and track fleeing victims across multiple states, but they also had the manpower to simultaneously conduct surveillance, intimidation, and even violence on a large scale. What was troubling was that Peyton was not just attracting attention from the local community. Federal officials were also watching him, but not to help expose the crimes. The federal agents were concerned that a Charleston photographer was disrupting long-standing relationships between law enforcement and the mountain community. When Peyton confronted them, they revealed that Greylock had been providing intelligence on criminal activity in the mountains for years, and disrupting that relationship could affect other federal investigations. The message was clear and terrifying. Greylock's crimes were protected by federal authorities because they provided valuable information. The bureaucracy not only failed to stop them, but also protected their brutality in exchange for intelligence. By the spring of 1889, Peyton found himself trapped in an expanding nightmare. His efforts to expose one family's crimes had revealed a web of corruption cover-ups and cruelty that permeated every level of government and law enforcement. The photograph of the 17 chained children was no longer just evidence of child abuse, but evidence of the systemic failure of American institutions that allowed such horrors to persist under the guise of official protection. But the most terrifying development was yet to come. In April 1889, Peyton learned that 3 more children had disappeared from remote mountain homes, with signs that Greylock had once again intervened. The family did not retreat when attention was called. They expanded their operations, confident that their protective net would prevent any consequences. Things came to a head on the night of May 15, 1889, when a boy named Michael Brennan made a daring escape. He traveled 27 miles of treacherous mountains to the town of Cedar Ridge. What was astonishing was not just the distance or the dangers he overcame, but that Michael had been born in the hollow, the product of Greylock's breeding program, and had never set foot outside the valley in his 14 years. Michael's appearance at Cedar Ridge created an immediate sensation, threatening to shatter the veil of silence that had maintained Greylock's secrecy for so many years. Unlike other escapees who might be considered stubborn or unruly, Michael possesses detailed knowledge of the hollow, from maps of its buildings to lists of names of children still in its custody, to personal effects of deceased children that can be cross-checked with missing persons records from multiple counties. When Michael walks into the Cedar Ridge Sheriff's office early that morning, his appearance alone shatters any pretense of normalcy. His body bears the marks of systemic abuse, broken bones that have not healed properly, punitive burns, and severe malnutrition that make him look younger than his actual age. But what makes officials trust him is his almost encyclopedic knowledge of psychology, detailing the methods Greylock uses to control, punish, and eliminate his victims. Even Sheriff Rutledge, who had previously been reluctant to investigate Greylock, is now forced to act when Michael's testimony is corroborated by multiple independent pieces of evidence. Here we want to ask you if you were one of the police or officials at that time. Would you dare to believe a 14-year-old boy telling about these horrible crimes? Write your answer in the comments below and imagine the pressure of having to decide between justice and power. Michael's accounts of the missing children matched the official reports to an astonishing degree, something that would have been impossible if he had not personally known each of the victims. His maps of the hollow were accurate to the last detail, matching surveys made decades earlier. Michael also revealed Greylock's corrupt practices to local officials, information that an outsider could never have known. What was most compelling was how Michael obtained all this evidence. As a child born into the hollow, he was trusted more than children taken from outside and was tasked with helping with the record keeping, which required basic literacy. Through years of furtive observation and secret notes, Michael had compiled a detailed documentation system of the entire Greylock family's activities, from children who died to those who were sold to those who were killed as a deterrent. The photograph taken by Henry Peaton in 1887 is only a small part of the horrifying truth. When Michael escaped in 1889, the hollow contained 47 children and adolescents in varying degrees of captivity, from 6-year-olds who had been captured to 20-year-old girls who had spent their entire lives in slavery, now forced to give birth to the next generation of slaves. What motivated Michael to escape was the discovery that the Greylock family was planning to eliminate all of their current victims and move their operations to the New West, where federal territory was less subject to legal control than the established states. This cleanup plan was to cover up the massacre under the guise of disease, burning the bodies to erase all traces. This was the first time Greylock had contemplated committing crimes on such a large scale. Michael had heard Ezekiel discuss in detail how to kill 47 people efficiently while maintaining plausible deniability, and he realized that escape was his only option if he did not want to see everyone he had ever known killed. With Michael's testimony and evidence, Sheriff Rutledge finally assembled a force capable of confronting Greylock directly. But organizing the attack required absolute secrecy, as Greylock's network of spies and corrupt officials permeated local law enforcement. The final task force consisted of outside federal agents, volunteers unaffiliated with local authorities, and a handful of highly trusted local police. The raid on Bone Creek Hollow took place on June 3rd, 1889, and what they found was even more horrifying than Michael had claimed. The hollow had indeed been turned into a sophisticated complex for systematic human exploitation, but on a scale far greater than anyone could have imagined. In addition to the 47 victims, identified authorities discovered hundreds more spanning the 55 years the Greylocks had occupied the valley. The physical evidence was too overwhelming to deny. Mass graves contained the bodies of children who had died of abuse, malnutrition, or execution. Detailed ledgers recorded the capture, exploitation, and treatment of victims with the mechanical precision of a corporate ledger. The entire complex contained torture devices, shackles and chains demonstrating a level of sophisticated cruelty that would make even seasoned police officers shudder in amazement. And now, Sleepy History Tales viewers, I want to ask you, if you saw this scene with hundreds of victims and torture devices like that, what would you do? Write your thoughts in the comments below. Let's imagine what it would be like to be faced with a crime of unprecedented scale in American history. But the most horrifying thing was that Greylock was not limited to Bone Creek Hollow. Documents seized during the raid revealed correspondence and dealings with similar criminal networks spanning 7 states, revealing a system of organized child exploitation that had existed for decades in Appalachia. The letters detailed the sale and transfer of children between families, the sharing of punishment techniques, and coordination to bribe local officials or eliminate witnesses. The face-to-face encounter was both slow and terrifying. When the task force arrived at the hollow Greylock stood there, calmly, seemingly anticipating the visit. Ezekiel Greylock, now in his 60s, but still retaining the cold intelligence with which he had built his criminal empire, greeted the authorities with politeness and began to explain everything they would find. His strategy was sophisticated and almost successful. Instead of denying it, Ezekiel produced false documents proving that his family was acting under government orders, supposedly as part of a secret program, and named federal officials who approved and supervised his activities. However, Michael Brennan, who was present with the task force, foiled the plot. His intimate knowledge of the hollow led investigators to evidence that contradicted the carefully prepared lie. More importantly, his testimony about the planned massacre exposed Greylock as having feigned cooperation, only to buy time to destroy the most important evidence. When investigators searched the entire complex, they found that several buildings had been prepared for demolition, with kerosene ready to burn records and evidence. Many of the children in custody had even been poisoned during breakfast, suggesting a plan to eliminate witnesses even if they appeared to cooperate. This systematic cruelty was only stopped in time, saving the lives of most of the victims. The incident revealed the calculating ruthlessness of Greylock. Even when faced with the risk of exposure, they prioritized erasing evidence over human life. The fast and cold efficiency with which they planned to kill dozens of children suggested that these actions were routine, not desperate. The trials that followed the raid became some of the most important in West Virginia history. But the search for justice turned out to be as complicated and horrifying as the crime. The scale of the corruption forced authorities to confront the reality that Greylock's operation was sustained by systemic failures at every level of government and society. Ezekiel Greylock and his family were convicted of everything from kidnapping and murder to racketeering and conspiracy. But the trial revealed a web of complicity that extended far beyond the Hollow 12 county officials. 6 judges and numerous police officers were charged with concealing or directly assisting in the crimes. The investigation and prosecution lasted more than 3 years, tearing apart the power structures in 4 counties. The fate of the rescued children was another challenge. Many, especially those born in the Hollow, had no legal identity and no knowledge of life outside. Reunion with their families was almost impossible. Most had no memory of their past, and their families had long considered them dead. The psychological impact of years of abuse of the system was equally devastating. The children developed unusual psychological reactions and inexplicable behaviors that medical science had no way of treating. Some were unable to adapt to normal life and required lifelong care. Others returned to the mountains, perhaps returning to the only life they had ever known. Despite the horrors, Michael Brennan, whose courage exposed the crimes and saved dozens of lives, became a symbol of both heroism and tragedy. He later built a new life in Pennsylvania, working as a teacher and child rights reform advocate, but was haunted by the crime he failed to save and the years of witnessing pain in silence before his escape. The photograph of Henry Patton, which launched the entire investigation, was introduced into evidence at the trial and quickly became one of the most influential legal documents in American history. The image of 17 children chained in the snow forced the public to confront the fact that organized cruelty could exist in their own communities, hidden behind a facade of sanctity and protected by a web of corruption. The consequences of Bone Creek Hollow went far beyond punishing individual criminals. The investigation revealed that similar systems could be operating in remote areas of the country, protected by isolation, corruption, and willful indifference. The same factors that had protected Greylock for decades. Subsequent federal laws required greater oversight of foster care and child care facilities and harsher penalties for officials who failed to report abuse. Enforcement, however, remained uneven in remote rural areas. Most disturbingly, some children who were sold or transferred to other criminal networks were never found. Greylock's files show that dozens of victims disappeared across the American West, merging into exploitation networks that authorities could not trace. Bone Creek Hollow was abandoned after the trial, and nature gradually reclaimed the complex where so much suffering had occurred. Local communities, still haunted, chose to forget rather than remember. The hollow returned to silence, but this time it was a silence of shame, not of complicity. Sarah Kellerman, a key witness, never fully recovered from the psychological trauma of reliving her years in captivity during the trial. She spent the rest of her life working with missing children organizations, pushing for the creation of the first missing children databases in American law. The Greylock case forced American society to confront difficult questions. What is the price of isolation? What are the dangers of unchecked power? It showed that systemic cruelty can flourish when communities choose to ignore, when officials put convenience before justice, and when vulnerable children exist beyond their protection. The photograph that Henry Patton risked his life to preserve now hangs in the West Virginia State Archives, a reminder of both human evil and courage. Those 17 faces frozen in time and silver-hallied continue to bear witness to crimes that many would rather forget, ensuring that their pain is not in vain and their stories are not lost to history. Ultimately, the Bone Creek Hollow case is one of the darkest chapters in American crime history. But it also demonstrates that even the most carefully crafted systems of oppression can be overthrown by individual courage and the persistent search for truth. The 17 children in the photo waited for justice for more than 50 years, and finally they got it, thanks to a photographer who refused to back down, a boy who risked his life to expose the truth, and a society that finally dared to face its own failures. This case reminds us that the greatest horrors often hide behind a facade of sanctity, protected not by supernatural forces, but by people's lack of courage, compassion, and integrity. What do you think of this story? Can organized cruelty persist for so long in remote communities? Leave a comment below. If you enjoyed this story and want more chilling stories, don't forget to subscribe, turn on notifications, and share it with someone who loves mysteries. See you in the next video.